They dressed him in silk, not for comfort, but for control. He was only a boy, nameless in the eyes of history, yet priceless in the markets of Rome. A child taken not for his strength, not for his labor, but for his beauty. Stripped from his home, carried across deserts and seas, and delivered into the heart of an empire that saw bodies as possessions and silence as obedience. Behind the golden walls of the emperor's palace, there were treasures too dark to be written in marble. Treasures that were alive. Rome loved to celebrate its victories, the gladiators in the Colosseum, the generals draped in triumph, the emperors carved into gods. But what Rome didn't celebrate were the boys hidden in chambers lit by oil lamps, dressed in perfume and jewels, trained to dance, to smile, to obey. They were not free. They were not even considered human. They were ornaments of power. This boy, faceless, voiceless, was called a pleasure servant. A term soft enough to hide the violence it carried. Behind closed doors, he was nothing more than property. The empire wrote down the names of its rulers, its senators, its conquerors. But boys like him? They were shadows, erased before they could even speak. Imagine Rome at the height of its glory. Marble temples gleaming in the sun, armies marching across continents, citizens feasting in banquets where gold spilled like water. And yet within those same palaces, children were broken in silence. Their lives measured not in years but in commands. Their innocence traded for coins, their bodies claimed by men who already owned the world. He was 14 when the palace guards came for him at night. He had no voice left to protest. Questions had been beaten out of him long ago. That night would be the first, but it would not be the last. His story is not carved on Roman stones. His name is not remembered in dusty scrolls, but his pain was real. His voice, silenced in his time, has survived in fragments, whispers, and scars left on the memory of history itself. This is not the story of an emperor. This is not the story of Rome's victories. This is the story Rome tried to bury. The story of the forgotten boys of empire. He was not born into silk. He was born into dust, a nameless village somewhere in the eastern provinces of the empire, Syria, perhaps Cappadocia. No one could ever be certain. His family were farmers, hands cracked from soil, backs bent beneath the weight of harvests that were never enough. Rome demanded taxes, grain, and coin. And when the fields could not give more, Rome demanded something else. The tax collector didn't need to shout. His soldiers stood in the doorway, their spears angled like shadows against the mud walls. His mother clutched the boy's shoulders, her fingers trembling, her eyes searching for mercy that would never come. The offer was simple, cruel, impossible. Silver coins in exchange for the child. Not for work, not for labor, for beauty. His father stared at the ground, broken by debts he could never repay. And so with a single nod, their son was no longer theirs. The boy was led away before dawn. He remembered the silence of that morning more than the voices. No farewell, no cries, just silence, as if grief itself was too dangerous to speak aloud. The journey began across deserts where the air burned, through crowded slave pens where he was inspected like livestock. Traders pulled his chin up, examined his teeth, measured his arms not for strength, but for shape. He wasn't meant to build roads or carry stones. He was destined for something far stranger. On the ship that carried him west, the boy watched the sea until his eyes ached. He listened to languages he didn't understand, shouts of sailors, prayers whispered in the dark. Every day the horizon stretched further, until at last the coast of Italy rose like a wall of stone from the water. Rome, the empire's beating heart. The city was unlike anything he had imagined. Streets alive with color, temples rising like mountains, statues gleaming in the sun. But he was not brought to the markets, nor to the fields. His path wound up the Palatine Hill, where marble walls guarded the emperor's residence. There the real transformation began. They stripped him of his clothes, of the rough tunic that still smelled faintly of home. They bathed him in oils, rubbed his skin until it glistened, combed perfumes into his hair. He was given silk robes far too fine for a child who had once run barefoot in the dirt. A robe that didn't belong to him and never would. His name, the one whispered by his mother, was taken. In its place they gave him another, soft and meaningless, designed to be forgotten as easily as he would be. Older servants, men who had long since buried their own pasts, taught him the rules. Where to kneel, when to look down, how to smile when spoken to, how to serve wine without spilling, how to dance with slow, fluid grace. Every gesture, every breath was rehearsed. His body was no longer his. It was an instrument, polished and trained to please. At night, he lay awake in his chamber, listening to the footsteps of guards echo through marble halls. Sometimes he heard music drifting from the banquet rooms, laughter of senators and generals celebrating their victories. Sometimes he heard cries muffled behind heavy doors, voices of others like him, voices that quickly fell silent. In those first weeks, he tried to remember his village, the faces of his parents, the sound of his own language. But memory blurred, swallowed by incense, marble, and the endless orders of the palace. His life before Rome began to feel like a dream, and dreams had no place here. He was an ornament now, part of the emperor's household, a possession to be polished, displayed, and hidden. Like the golden plates on the banquet table, like the ivory statues in the garden, he belonged not to himself, but to Rome. And so the boy learned. He learned to bow when told, to smile when commanded, to move as silently as the marble gods staring down from their pedestals. Each day he disappeared a little more, until nothing of the farmer's son remained, only silk, perfume, and silence. The boy's new life was not marked by seasons or years, but by rituals. Morning began with the scent of incense, the heavy splash of water in marble basins, the scraping of bronze combs through hair. He was taught to move like flowing silk, to let his steps glide as though his feet never touched the ground. Every gesture mattered, the way he poured wine, the way he bowed, the way he smiled without showing his teeth. He was never alone, but always lonely. Other boys drifted through the palace like shadows, each one renamed, each one reshaped. They whispered in stolen moments, but never too loudly. Questions were dangerous. Memories were more dangerous still. At banquets, the boy stood in silence while senators feasted. He watched men with blood on their hands laugh beneath ceilings painted with gods. He saw generals boasting of victories while slaves carried their trophies. And always he felt eyes on him, measuring, deciding, claiming. When he was summoned to dance, the room fell into silence. Music filled the air, but it was not for beauty. It was for control. His body was the instrument, and every movement was a reminder that he did not belong to himself. The applause never came. Only stares, only commands. He was 14 when the guards came for him one night. He followed without a word, because words had long ago been beaten into silence. The chamber he entered was drenched in oil lamps. Curtains fluttered like breath. The emperor reclined on a couch of lion skins, jewels glittering on his hands. Laughter echoed. Wine spilled, voices called for entertainment. The boy danced. When the music ended, there was no escape. A hand beckoned him closer. That night was the first, it was not the last. From then on, time blurred. Days were counted not by meals or moons, but by touches, by orders, by the weight of gazes that claimed pieces of him. Sometimes he was sent to amuse senators. Other times, he was offered to foreign dignitaries, a gift wrapped in silk, admired like furniture, discarded when the night was over. He was passed like a coin, like a jewel, like a secret too shameful to admit in daylight. He learned to smile through everything, to smile when hands gripped his face like clay to be molded, to smile when they threatened to cut his hair, his voice, his manhood, to smile when they told him he was lucky. His face became a mask, but behind it something cracked, deeper and deeper each day. The palace whispered of darker things. A boy who screamed for hours behind locked doors and was never seen again. Blood cleaned from marble floors before dawn. A new emperor who rose to power after the old one was poisoned, his tastes sharper, his games crueler. The boy knew better than to ask questions. In Rome, silence was survival. But survival had a cost. Each day he felt himself slipping further away, as though the person he had once been, the farmer's son, the barefoot child who had run through fields, had died the moment he entered those gates. What remained was a shadow draped in silk. And yet somewhere deep inside, a fragment of him still resisted. He found corners where torchlight did not reach, where he could hide, even for moments. He listened from behind columns, from beneath staircases. He heard the senators whisper about rebellions, about shortages of grain, about wars tearing at the edges of the empire. The great city trembled. But inside the palace, nothing changed. They feasted. They laughed. They destroyed. The boy began to wonder if Rome could fall, not by swords or fire, but by rot, by the silent cruelty hidden behind its marble walls. The night began like so many others. The scent of wine, the clash of golden cups, the low hum of music echoing off marble. The boy was summoned again, draped in silk so sheer it revealed more than it hid. His bare feet traced the cold stone as guards led him into the emperor's private chamber. But something was different tonight. The room was crowded not only with senators, but with generals, foreign envoys, and the emperor's closest advisors. Laughter filled the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. The emperor sat in the center, his face flushed with power and drink. "Dance," he commanded. The boy obeyed. His movements were practiced perfection. Flowing arms, lowered eyes, the body of a servant, the grace of a shadow. But this time, the silence that followed was not the usual silence. It was heavier. Anticipation crackled like lightning in the room. The emperor leaned forward. "Bring the whip." The words froze the boy in place. For a moment he thought he had misheard. Then the guards returned, carrying a lash of knotted leather, its edges tipped with small bronze hooks. The room shifted, voices hushed, wine cups stilled. "This one," the emperor said, pointing. "He has grown too proud, too silent, too perfect. Let Rome see what happens when perfection forgets who owns it." Two guards seized the boy's arms. His body fought instinctively, but resistance was useless. They dragged him forward, throwing him to the floor in front of the guests. His knees struck stone, his face pressed against the cold marble. The whip cracked through the air. The sound alone tore a scream from his throat before it even touched his skin. Then came the first lash, fire tearing across his back, hooks ripping flesh. Gasps and laughter rippled through the crowd. Some looked away. Most leaned closer. Strike after strike fell, each one burning deeper, drawing blood that streaked across the polished floor. He bit his tongue until it bled. But the cries escaped anyway, echoing through the chamber like an animal caught in a trap. Between lashes he saw their faces, senators smirking, generals whispering, women covering their smiles with jeweled hands. And at the center the emperor, watching with a calm, almost bored expression. This was not punishment. This was theater. When the whip finally stilled, the boy lay trembling in a pool of red. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurred. He thought it was over, but the emperor raised a hand and the room fell silent again. "Cut his hair." The word struck harder than the lash. Hair was sacred. It was the last trace of who he had been, the last symbol of the boy his parents once knew. He shook his head weakly, whispering a plea that no one could hear. The guards grabbed a bronze knife, fingers tangled in his hair, yanking his head back. He felt the cold blade press against his scalp. In that instant, something inside him snapped. With the last of his strength, he twisted free, his blood-slicked body slipping from their grip. He stumbled to his feet, dizzy, broken, yet alive. The crowd gasped, not in pity, but in outrage. How dare a slave move without permission? How dare he rise? The boy staggered toward the door. Guards lunged, but his blood made him slippery, untouchable for one brief, miraculous moment. He crashed into a table, sending goblets and golden plates clattering to the floor. He ran, shouts erupted, sandals pounded against marble. Torches flared as the chase thundered through corridors. His bare feet left streaks of blood on the white stone. He turned corners blindly, memory and terror guiding him more than sight. Behind him, the emperor's voice roared, "Do not kill him! Bring him back." But the boy had no intention of being brought back. Through halls of mosaics, past statues of gods who watched with cold, unblinking eyes, he fled. Every step was agony, every breath a knife. Yet the thought of chains, of the lash, of the knife at his scalp drove him faster. At last he burst into the night air. The courtyard lay before him, bathed in moonlight. Marble columns stretched high, shadows pooling between them like dark rivers. For a moment, freedom seemed close enough to touch. Then he saw them. Guards lined the gates, spears raised, shields locked. His escape had ended before it had begun. The boy slowed, chest heaving, body trembling. Behind him, footsteps closed in. He was trapped, but in that moment, as the circle tightened around him, a strange calm spread through his veins. For the first time in years, he felt something like control. Not freedom, but defiance. He lifted his head, blood dripping from his chin, and stared directly at the emperor who had followed into the courtyard. Gasps echoed when the boy did the unthinkable. He spat at the emperor's feet. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. The crowd froze. The world itself seemed to stop. Then the emperor's face twisted with fury. "Take him," he snarled. The guards surged forward. Hands seized him, dragging him back into the shadows of the palace. His fate was sealed, but as they pulled him away, he did not scream. He did not beg. He smiled, bloody, broken but unbroken inside. Because in the heart of Rome, where even emperors ruled through fear, a nameless boy had given them something they would never forget: his defiance. They dragged him back into the palace that night, but what became of him was never written in marble, never recorded in scrolls. Rome did not carve the names of slaves into history. For the empire, he was nothing, disposable, forgettable. And yet, his story lived in whispers. Servants carried it from corridor to corridor. Guards repeated it in hushed tones by the torchlight, and even senators remembered the boy who had spat in the emperor's face. A nameless child stripped of family, dignity, and freedom, but not of defiance. Rome prided itself on control, on bending nations, crushing enemies, reshaping men and women into tools for its glory. But in that courtyard, in that single act of rebellion, the mask slipped. The world saw what the empire truly was: a machine built on suffering, one that feared even the smallest spark of resistance. The boy's fate was sealed in blood, but his defiance could not be erased. For the slaves who heard his story, it became a quiet source of strength. For the courtiers who witnessed it, it became a memory they could never banish. And for us, centuries later, it remains a reminder, because history remembers emperors and their victories, their temples and their laws. But behind those victories lay countless forgotten lives, children taken, voices silenced, bodies broken. Rome called itself eternal, yet its eternity was built on bones. And still, in the cracks of that empire, humanity endured. In the scream of a boy beneath the whip, in the desperate footsteps echoing through palace halls, in the bloodied smile of a child who dared to defy an emperor. It is easy to forget the nameless, easy to be dazzled by marble and gold, by triumphal arches and immortal statues. But Rome's true story is not only in its monuments, it is in the shadows, in the people who suffered, resisted, and disappeared. The boy's name is lost, but his defiance echoes still, a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, is always afraid of the human spirit. And perhaps that is why Rome, for all its grandeur, eventually crumbled. Not from the swords of barbarians alone, but from within, from the rot of cruelty, from the weight of 1,000 silenced voices. The boy was one of those voices, and though the empire tried to erase him, history whispers his truth, that even in the darkest corridors of power, a single act of defiance can burn brighter than a crown of gold.